new episode, and this episode is very, very important. Already, you know that World Talent Economy Forum, we are launching one of the largest public-private partnership dialogue in Asia Pacific in Dubai Expo, and we will discuss about the climate change, and we are developing a blueprint for Asia Pacific, especially for Malaysia. And the speakers, those who join today, they will join in the World Talent Economy Forum discussions. Lot of good news actually happening. The BBC, Reuters, International Chamber of Commerce, all of them actually collaborating with World Talent Economy Forums, and uh, different countries prime minister office and the climate change division, they start to believe that World Talent Economy Forum can contribute. And perhaps in the Dubai Expo, all of the largest corporations from Malaysia and other countries, they will join. And I want to start from Professor James. He is one of the famous speakers from Stanford universities, and I'm really grateful that he joins. So how you want to contribute for today's discussion? And another things, we are big fan of your village projects. Already it's very popular. Even today's in the meeting with the climate change divisions, we discuss about your projects. And we have a visions, almost 10 million people from 10 different states, they join World Talent Economy Forum for this kind of projects. So how we can contribute for this kind of life-changing event? Professor
Sure.
James.
I mean, yeah, I'd be happy to share my screen. That's okay.
Yes.
I'll show you a few slides. Not sure which screen. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Sorry.
Okay. The just share button, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
The suspense is killing me.
Can you see my screen?
Okay. Yes, I think.
Yes?
Yes.
You see my screen?
Yes, Professor.
So,
Yes.
yeah, our primary thesis is has been for over a decade that cities are vibrant and wonderful, but they're also brittle. So we need to look at urgently creating the circumstances for living healthy, flourishing, regenerative, and resilient lifestyles just outside of cities and then further into the peri-urban and the rural areas. Because as a species, we only occupy maybe 2 or 3% of the available landmass on Earth. Our work really is inspired by nature. It's this idea of creating software that can both design and operate these beautiful self-reliant neighborhoods based on the mycorrhizal mycelial interaction under the soil floor. So these are these lovely fibrous networks that are conveyor belt of all kinds of goodies, nutrients, carbon, sugar, minerals. It's a have-need conveyor belt that is a long-term ledger, actually, under the forest floor. And so if you can imagine the ability to use machine learning and AI to design the neighborhoods of the future, that we can combine both healthy living in housing density for social affordable access, but also that 2/3 of the available landmass can be attributed to productive farming. So we're not paving over farmland. We're actually creating more biodiverse and resilient restorative practices. The key really is delicious food at your doorstep, high yield, organic, biodynamic, soil-based farming. It's a whole kind of quilt and patchwork of bioavailable nutrition at your doorstep, married with controlled environment farming. So aquaponic, aeroponic systems for year-round kind of climate-proof cultivation. And so you get this picture of literally tons of healthy food being generated. We've been looking really at this whole concept in the nexus of a metabolic integration that previously siloed neighborhood infrastructure can now finally learn about each other, improve from each other, and mitigate against risk. So again, our Village OS software is designed primarily to both design and operate these very beautiful, lush communities. And then from a Tesla perspective or Bucky Fuller perspective, that these neighborhoods could communicate with each other and learn and improve or mitigate based on where they are in climate zones. And the key again for us is social, affordable access to these kinds of regenerative, resilient neighborhoods at an urgent pace. Okay, we have a critical housing shortage on Earth. We also have never been more disassociated from our natural world. And by doing these things, we can improve healthy outcomes. We can actually increase longevity, improve and reduce burdens on governments at all levels, and have a better way to age in place. So we understand the future of mobility is going to be autonomous with drone deliveries and drone taxis. And this is also germane to what's happening right now in logistics and supply chains. We have to be hyperlocal and regional, right, in our production and our thinking. So we've got some amazing technical partners. I continue my affiliation at Stanford in the School of Medicine, in the Stanford Flourishing Project. I'm also appointed faculty to Singularity University. And the key for us really is this Stanford spinoff that we founded as a Dutch holding company, creating this vision really for sovereign wealth and pension fund finances that have divested from fossil fuels, that are looking for asset-backed residential development, but that also check off all the boxes for the future of living on a happy, healthy planet. So I thank you for this time. It was brief, but I'm happy to take questions and look forward to participating. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Professor James. This is an excellent presentation, Professor. Actually, I just want to share few of my views because I am from a small villages from a developing nations, so I have some different perceptions and real understanding about village and developing nations. Because I will be really happy that this kind of visionary projects, if we can see in the developing nations and the millions of people actually getting the benefit from these kind of things. Yes, I want to say for Malaysia, some Singapore, and this kind of country, this kind of visionary project is absolutely fine. Yes, we want this kind of project. But in some point in India, let's say we have around 500,000 people from remote area, from Bangladesh, from Indonesia, some point. So example, they do not have a very good infrastructure. Let's say these people are honest and sincere, but the most of the people not highly educated. The most of the organization is not they're out of even internet. Even they do not have opportunity to engage with AI and this kind of things. Even in South Asia, we are observing, according to World Economy Forum, even India, 40% infrastructure they have for AI, internet, and this kind of things. So how your model will be applicable for them? And especially we are discussing about a healthcare issue. Healthcare is a very important thing. Even my father was a freedom fighter. He was a educated peoples and a very good politicians. Even he died without treatment. So in 2017, I'm sorry, because of I can understand the real world, that's why I'm sharing. So how your model can be helpful for these developing nations and how we can work together?
Yeah, so the very simply put, I mean, we look at this whole concept of design for extreme affordability, and it's completely within our grasp right now to look at rural India, across ASEAN, for sub-Saharan Africa, across MENA, wherever it's not affordable to live, that there are actually places where we can be restorative in what we do with the permaculture, with how we design for passive homes, and so you can still use software from a design perspective to create these communities based on this logic that's input. So the ingested data that comes in is relevant to those climate zones. But moreover, is that we can create these places that impoverished people can actually stay and work and live. And then because they have their basic needs met, they can then go back into school and education, or keep their kids in school and education. Whereas, during the dry season in rural India, people have to migrate to the cities to work, which means the kids aren't in school during these times. So there's all these levels and rings of poverty that we can get to and unravel once we start to build these communities at scale. So we can do it in a much more cost-effective way.
Mhm. Excellent. From our speakers like Professor Rob, Professor David Schumacher, or Professor David Smith, if you have any question or analysis of like today's discussion, Professor Rob.
Sorry, you want me to respond to the presentation that's happened, or you want me to continue on the thought process? I mean, what was the
Yes.
question you're asking me?
Yeah, like you can contribute like how Professor James actually analyzed the model. So in that way, and beside that, you can open up some questions or some idea for implementing these climate change projects.
Well, as you know, in our past conversations, I'm a big fan of the underlying concepts of advanced agriculture and moving to more of a hydroponics type of concept as we move the agricultural process indoors in those areas that can no longer sustain it outdoors, and certainly using scientific methods to improve the yields from fields that now are not getting the water they need, and in areas where the climate has become too warm to sustain those crops. Also, you've got biological engineering of the crops to allow them to sustain far more strongly. But we were, I think, talking a bit more, at least on topic of medicine and climate change and disease and climate change. And there, I think the topic's a bit different in that what we're seeing is the migration of certain pests like mosquitoes into areas where they couldn't be sustained before, and they're spreading disease. We have the issues surrounding the impact of heat on indigenous life forms, including people. We're finding ourselves getting much angrier as a result of this, and we may need either medication or counseling to reduce the anger and resulting violence. Entire species of animals are dying out because of these changes, and of course that's having an overarching impact on our ecology. So it's a case now, I think, and James pointed out correctly, where we need to start aggressively mitigating a lot of these problems, because at least near term we're not going to be changing these trends, and so finding ways to scientifically address the climate changes so that we can continue to sustain life is incredibly important. It was a great presentation. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Professor David Smith.
Thank you.
I agree with actually a lot of what Rob said there, and enjoyed James's presentation there. To me, you know, the climate change, we've looked at so many different areas, but as you look at it, particularly in this one titled, let's look at it from a health perspective. Um, Health is one of the areas that's often highly glossed over when you talk about climate change, but really isn't delved into very much. And when you begin to look at experimentation and implementation around demonstration projects and others like the villages, it still is kind of one of the afterthoughts as you look in there. Some of the public impacts of climate change include changes in mortality and hospitalization, particularly when you look at things like the heat waves, the floods, the droughts. All of these have profound impacts in healthcare. You see changes in how vector food and waterborne infectious diseases are transmitted. We've seen a lot of those changes just in the last 3 years on that side. You see changes in chemical exposures by the air, food, and water. And one of the often overlooked changes of how climate change impacts health is its impact upon mental health. And mental health is the hidden elephant that is impacted in areas like this, and is one that, as you begin to look from a policy standpoint across all levels of nations in the world, should be a very important consideration as you look at health and climate change put together. But as you've heard me often say, the ecosystem of health and climate change is very complex, many layers. many opportunities for all the stakeholders of the Technopolis, from the government to academia to commercial to the citizens, have to come together to address it. And you've heard me talk particularly about technology, how everything is a systems of systems. Well, if I look at climate change and health, it takes the systems of systems approach and blows it up even further because of the impacts, particularly on healthcare, that are known and unknown around climate change. And some of climate change is actually good for health. A lot of it's not good for health. So it's a complex systems problem that deserves to be viewed from a complex system protocol. So that's kind of my
Thank you.
initial thought.
Thank you, Professor James. Like, if you want to add some point specifically for this healthcare system and this topic, so I want to give you the
It's really
floor, and then
simple. I mean, health starts at home. Health starts at home.
Mhm,
So when
mhm,
you have the circumstance where you have healthy living, dignified housing that's
mhm,
generating more power than your family needs, based on
mhm,
earth and circular building materials, connected to
mhm,
permaculture farming and controlled environment farming. You have clean water, clean energy, waste to resource management, high yield organic food production. All of these are within our grasp at the neighborhood scale. You open your door and your natural resources are available to you. By doing that, you create agency. That access and agency means greater health. This is proven research, the blue zone research, for instance. People are living longer, healthier, happier lives. So
mhm,
it's actually quite simple for us to do these things. We just have to change the policies, the laws, and the
mhm.
rules and regulations around self reliant community development. And it's really about capital to get these things built. Once we solve for that, it's not a matter of science, technology, or physics.
Mhm. Thank you, Professor. Professor David Schumacher.
Yes, thank you, Sharif. Yeah, a couple of topics. James, first of all, thank you very much for that great presentation. And thank you for mentioning policy and others who have mentioned policy this morning, because policy is the lens through which I see. I'm in the state of Arizona. The state of Arizona, 84% of this state is uh, in severe drought conditions. We get our water from the Colorado River, and for the first time ever, Tier 1 water shortages will be affecting the state. You can say that's bad, but as others will say, there's a silver lining to what's bad and it can be good, because Arizona, as a political body, has been resistant to the idea of climate change and mitigation, and even taking a more, what I like to approach, scientific look at how to uh, uh, make adaptations as well. I think it takes both mitigation and adaptations, but it starts with policy. And if we can't get the general populace involved and directed in that direction, then a lot of these great ideas just go unheard. So, this tier one water shortage is allowing people to hear things that they couldn't hear before. And I do believe that it's allowing politicians to uh, be able to change their viewpoints publicly without being seen as hypocritical or as changing their mind, which unfortunately can be a bad thing in politics unless there's a really good driver. And this becomes a good driver. Now, a couple of you are from my neighboring state of California, and we've seen what's been going on with the fires there. This has also helped. But here in Arizona, bringing it close to home, I think really makes the difference. And maybe this is a takeaway, Sharif, for your part of the world too, because as it affects Malaysia and the surrounding areas close to home, you can start to build on the public sentiment as it changes and touches people's lives. There's one thing about reading it in the newspaper or seeing it wherever you get your news, and the other thing about it affecting you. So, how will it affect people here in Arizona? Well, it'll affect them from the standpoint that water rationing in the county that I'm in, which is the largest county in Arizona, will probably hit agriculture the hardest. When people think of the Arizona desert, you don't think of agriculture, but we have a canal system that brings water to farms. And I can drive just to the outskirts of Phoenix and see green fields that are fed by the Colorado River. Those will be the first things to shrink as we go. So that's a visual to the people living in the area of what's happening, but it also means that the idea of being able to access those crops locally vanishes. It goes away. We lose that resiliency. So I'm not painting doom and gloom. I'm saying this is the reality, and people seeing the reality is a good thing. And we can uh, mobilize on that. So that's the aspect that I'm coming from. Uh,
Mhm.
Health is also a driver in this because local crops are fresher, less expensive than imports. Uh, just a quick digression, and then I'll turn it over to somebody else. Before the pandemic, I attended a conference called it was all about the ocean, and it was called Ocean Planet Conference. Was in Los Angeles, and we had a wide variety of presenters. So we had people there talking about politics. We had people there talking about conservation. We had the U.S. Navy there, which surprised me at first, but they wanted to talk about what was going on in the oceans, and they specifically addressed climate change. So there's also military aspects to this, which will affect people, politics, and the health. One of the quick takeaways was the amount of in the Yukon. You think of ice and snow going towards the Arctic. They've had a 2.3 degrees Celsius temperature increase from 1948 to 2016. They are 3 times the global rate of warming in that area. So, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it has to do with a couple of things. Once again, it's another headline that can be used to drive public policy, perhaps. But from the
Mhm.
military aspect, there are now areas that are navigable by large ships that never were before. And those now require security aspects because there are nations that will contend for those areas. That is an effect on health. The reducing amount of ice is also exposing uh, bacteria, perhaps other forms of life too that uh, we haven't experienced in a long time and have little resistance to. So these too can have an effect on health.
Mhm.
So it's a big issue. I carve out the area of public policy to talk about because that's what I work on here with the Transhumanist Party in Arizona. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the Transhumanist Party, our tagline is science, health, and technology at the forefront of American politics. And we really
Mhm.
mean American policy and we need worldwide policy because America does not live in a vacuum. So those are my comments this morning.
Thank you, Professor David Schumacher, bringing this point because even in the Monday, every Monday, we are arranging show with the developing nations representative, politicians, university, largest corporations, and you can see actually developing nations has a lot of problem to managing this kind of policy. So from the developed nations, especially this kind of scholars, we need support to develop better policy for developing nation. This is also important. Madam Betla, how you want to analyze today's topic and what input you want to give for today's session.
Thank you, Sharif. So I'm going to somewhat build on what David just said. The Lancet Commission said that the climate crisis is the greatest public health opportunity of the 21st century. They didn't say it was the greatest challenge. They said it was the greatest opportunity of the 21st century. And I believe that that's true, but also that it's probably a little too small. I think that this is potentially the greatest public health opportunity or global health opportunity of all human history if we rise to the occasion. And of course, there is so much already. It's not just that we're waiting for the great by and by when the climate change is going to start impacting human health. We already have catastrophic consequences as a result of, as has been pointed out, the droughts, for example, and the fires in my home state of California, you know, where for most of the summer, last summer and this summer, we had huge regions of the state where there isn't breathable air. And, you know, in Africa, where the droughts are making it impossible to farm, so people are starving as a result of the climate crisis. So there's already catastrophic things going on. And if we stay on the trajectory we're on, we know that it's going to get far worse, and that it ultimately could potentially lead to the extinction of humanity and most life on Earth, life as we know it anyway. So I want to focus on the opportunity part, though. And if we think about like what it's going to actually take to turn around the climate crisis, what it's going to actually take to bring emissions down to zero or very near to zero across all sectors, then we can really realize how much our health can improve globally. You know, you think about the clean air, the clean water, you know, the kinds of collaboration and cooperation that will be required among people and governments and between different governments to be able to put in place robust enough policies and to be able to not just make these empty promises that governments are making now, but really take action, and to have that kind of critical mass that David was talking about, where the public is demanding action. And so the government, you know, these elected officials feel emboldened to act without fear of losing their jobs. You know, that kind of collaboration and collegiality and activism and being proactive and visionary, like that says a lot for what's possible for the human species. But for me, because the organization I founded, Eat for the Earth, is very concerned about the fact that the dietary change that is necessary for us to be able to continue to live on this earth is such a small part of the climate change conversation. I want to think about and talk about just the impact of the dietary change that will be required in order for us to continue living on this earth, in order for us to keep temperatures within that 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade that the IPCC says is necessary. Global human diets will need to shift toward more plants and less animal products. And I think that was demonstrated in James's model. Like, if you have the agriculture integrated into the cities, you don't have these vast tracts of land to raise the amount of animals we need. And I didn't see any confined animal feeding operations in that model either, except maybe in the aquaponics. So shifting from that model, where we're now taking up 37% of the ice-free land to raise animals for food, that only produce 12% of our food, so wasteful. So right there, we're going to already realize a savings. And then we're also going to realize tremendous savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, health benefits, which is the topic of today, and even economy. So, for example, there was a study done by, the lead author was Marco Springman out of Oxford University, and this study was from 2016, and they projected out to 2050 what would happen if global diets changed more toward plant-based. They weren't talking about vegan diets. There was no ideology involved. They weren't talking about 100% plant-based diets, but just a shift toward more plants, and what would happen compared to the trajectory we're on. And what they found was that we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by from the food sector by 29 to 70%, that we'd reduce global mortality by 6 to 10%, and save potentially as much as 31 trillion in US dollars, because of course our healthcare costs will go down as a result of having healthier people. And so my main contribution to this conversation is that yes, this is an opportunity, but we must seize it, and we must do it, as has been mentioned, with haste. And that doing so will really have far-reaching benefits beyond just being able to keep living here, that we can live here in a better way. I just want to mention a couple other things. One, that because we're on the topic of health, and the whole world has been in the grip of a health crisis in the last 1.5 years with COVID, right? Well, the reason that pandemics are able to take over the globe is that humans are encroaching on the natural world, and we're entering into this human-animal interface in ways that are unhealthy and that bring these zoonotic diseases into our experience. And if we make these kinds of shifts that will be necessary to take advantage of this beautiful opportunity for our global human health and for the climate, and for our emotional well-being, as has been mentioned, if we make these kind of shifts, we're going to reduce the incidence of pandemics as well. And guess what? We're also going to be healthier when pandemics do happen, or if they happen, or if zoonotic disease breaks out in our neighborhoods. Because it's been demonstrated in a study last month, 2 studies actually came out last month, that showed that these kind of diets I'm talking about, these plant-strong and plant-based diets, that if someone is on a plant-based diet, kind of loosely construed, it includes eating a little bit of animal products, that they have a 73% reduced risk of getting a moderate to severe case of COVID than someone not on such a diet. You would think that this would have been headlines, because it's even better than the odds of getting a Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It was not headlines. You had to be in plant-based circles to see the research, but it was published in the British Medical Journal. So, we need to get the word out. We need to integrate the topic of diet into these climate conversations. And I think I'll leave it there. I've got a lot of other things to say. I want to thank everybody for their wisdom today. And I think that all together, if we were the ones running the world, we would have a much different situation today.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Betlab. Actually, your voice is very important, and all of our speakers' voice is very important right now, because the different organizations, those who actually love to contribute for the climate change, they are actually our audience, and we are working together. We are working as a team. So we need more strong voice like you, Mr. Marshall. So how you want to add to these discussions? And I know that you are climate change activist and you are very expert about like corporate contributions. So what do you think that corporate can play a major roles to solve this kind of problem, or how we should move forward?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities. First of all, I want to say the presentation was very good, excellent, in fact. And I think all the presenters to date have mentioned things that are contributing important information to this discussion. And what I'm going to add is just a few things. I'm going to circle back to 2 things. One, I think somebody made the connection between mental health, physical health, and climate change. And I just recently was able to participate in a forum where they connected mental health to physical health to climate change. And the biggest mental health issue on the planet right now is trauma, how people experience trauma and how they process that trauma, which causes a lot of the decision-making processes that people take, both politically, policy-wide, and other decision-making processes. So I think if you go in and you focus in on trauma, but make that connection to climate change and physical health, and I think the comments that were just made about food processing, they're all connected. We live in a very interconnected planet, and what we have a tendency to do is to stovepipe subjects. I mean, when somebody goes to medical school, they, in the beginning, learn all about the various aspects of medicine, and then they end up becoming a specialist in one area or another. That, all they do is either heart valves, or they only do brain surgery, and there's not too much interconnectedness between the different types of medicines that are practiced. So in one aspect, that's really good, because people become very good at what they do. But in another respect, we lose information and data, and we lose perspective, I think. So my contribution to this conversation is simply to say, I think everybody here has important items to contribute, just like the presentation, just like the last presentation or discussion point about food health and plant health and animal health. One of the things that we're working on is bringing a material known as char element. We call it elemental char. Other people call it biochar, which solves several problems at the same time. So we're able to deal with soil health, improving soil quality, just like that the presentation showed. You can add more capacity and more capability to the soil health, which can allow us to grow healthier foods and healthier crops. At the same time, we don't do it by taking products. We take waste. We're taking both organic and inorganic waste and converting them and making them as what we would call supply chain products. There's no such thing as waste for us anymore. All waste is doable except perhaps radioactive waste. That's one problematic issue, but we've got people working on that. But all organic and inorganic waste, whether it's PREF, which is pre-engineered textiles or plastics, all can be converted into something viable. And that viability has to do more with less with energy, although energy is important, but also creating products that reduce environmental impacts, improve soil health, improve air quality, and also improve water quality and livestock and other components. So I just wanted to share that with everybody, and I applaud everybody in this forum. Keep up the good work. Keep going. Let's all collaborate. And my last statement is what my father, who was kind of a Leonardo da Vinci character, always used to say. The big issue is, son, you don't know what you don't know. And I always asked him, what the hell does that mean? And he said, it means that everybody thinks they know, which they do. They know a lot, but they're not open necessarily to what they don't know. And what I like about this forum is we're all open to each other and learning from each other. So I applaud everybody, and let's keep up the good work. I'm done.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. The audience, especially, I know that different countries, government, federal government, central governments, as well as different corporations, those who are collaborating with World Talent Economy Forum. This is excellent discussion. These are the best resources around the world, and I'm sure all of our resources happy to contribute for your development. So if you have any kind of problem or any kind of solution you need, you directly can communicate with our speakers. Beside that, through World Talent Economy Forum, we can communicate and we will help you. So Professor Donald, so I know that long times we have discussions about the improvement of the society and many things. So how you want to analyze, Professor Donald?
Well, I like that. It's interesting that people brought up trauma and health, because my wife is a primary care nurse practitioner, and recently, due to a large study they did at Kaiser, they found that people who had childhood trauma wound up with significantly worse health outcomes. So what they've been doing now, they have is what's called trauma-informed care, and so part of her thing that she has to do when she's interviewing new patients, and is she has to actually go through his questionnaire to try and understand, were your parents divorced, one of your parents an alcoholic, various kinds of questions like that, which are strong indicators of childhood trauma. And I don't know completely what they do to help with that, but it's basically PTSD, and there are ways that we can help people with PTSD. Magic mushrooms, for an instance. That's another story. But trauma. So that's a completely direct link between global warming and climate change and health through the being mediated by trauma. I wish that that James hadn't left, because I spent some time after one of these shows really looking up and trying to understand about some of the agriculture and the effect of agriculture, and I went to quite a lot of different sources, and any one source is going to have their own view. So you have to triangulate, find different sources that say similar things, and look at how it is that they decided to make the knowledge claims that they make. Why should I believe what they tell me? And one of the things that I found is that there's very little solid knowledge about the relative between the relative amount of, let's say, put it this way, ecological benefit between organic and conventional agriculture. And one of the best studies, or the best studies that I've seen or that have been done, the largest and most comprehensive studies, all say that organic farming takes up significantly more land than conventional agriculture. So basically, the best study that I could find said that it was about 40% more land. And since we're already using 39% of land for agriculture, I think that I wonder a little bit. I mean, maybe with a stacked up hydroponic and things like that, we might be able to make it work a little better. But I lived in Finland for a while, and when you live in Finland, you have to get used to not eating fresh vegetables. I mean, they make absolutely fabulous cucumbers and tomatoes that they can grow in a hothouse, but beyond that, nothing. They have to bring up these. By the time the vegetables get there from Portugal or Spain, they're pretty past their use-by date. And so I question how effective it's going to be, because it's easier to grow crops in certain areas with certain kinds of conditions and certain kinds of things like that, where there's water, where there's not water, things like that. And so the idea of having every single solitary place be completely autonomous and disconnected from every other place, I'd love to see the actual evidence that could possibly work, and see studies. And another thing that I want to also mention is that human beings are social animals. And I don't know if people haven't lived in a small town or grown up in a small town, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. There's nothing to do. You look in California and you look at the towns, and you look at places like Lodi and Turlock and all these places, and the amount of drugs that the kids use there, it's insane. They don't have anything else to do. There's nothing for them. And in a strong social structure like that, if you turn out to be the kid that people bully or something else like that, your life is going to be, you're never going to go anywhere. Your life is going to be hell. There is absolutely nothing you can do about it, and except leave. And when you leave, where do you go? To another place that's just like that? No. People have been going to cities, and more than half the people in the world live in cities now. And I'm going to say, then the one other thing I'm going to say about this, I mean, it's just worth thinking about, because I don't think the research exists to be able to answer the questions that I'm raising right now. But if you look at basically various kinds of health issues, like for instance, I had a friend who had a very serious stroke. And his wife recognized what was going on, got him to Stanford. They did some sort of huge bypass thing in his brain, and he wound up with no damage to him at all. He was completely okay. And that was because he could be in Stanford Hospital in 10 minutes. But if you were living in some rural place with no transportation, maybe somebody'd have to send a helicopter out from, the equivalent of Stanford, pick you up and bring you back. It's too late by then. And so all kinds of diseases and problems like that. Right now in the United States, because of COVID, there's rural hospitals are closing all over the country. And you can just find story after story after story of people who are dying from treatable things because they can't there's no space in hospitals, and they're too far away from hospitals. So I question strongly whether it's better for people's health to be distributed. I question strongly whether we're going to be using resources more effectively by having this kind of village concept, because if we use more money or more land for growing crops and agriculture, where do we get that land? We're taking it away from forests. We're taking it away from all kinds of other natural things that we should be leaving alone. And concentrating people into small areas has the effect of causing them to do less damage. So I think there's a lot to be said for making cities more resilient, but also acknowledging the incredible value that cities have for us. And that's my take
Thank
on
you.
it.
Thank you, Mr. Jamsid.
Thank you, Sharif. Yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation too, and I want to thank you, Sharif, for assembling such a great panel. You know, if I was capable of being intimidated, I would be. But I want to point out my Stanford medical connection. Okay, I'm a consumer, not a producer, but I do take advantage of a wonderful health situation. So piggyback on what Donald is saying, you know, I am an urban creature, in part because that's my access to the Stanford healthcare. And but you know, the thing I wanted to say also that Marshall said that it was like, you know, no matter how much we know, we only know a little. And if we start with that, we know we have some humility when we tackle these great complex questions, which we must tackle, because this is a crisis. We can't just ignore it and hope that the next generation will deal with it. We have to deal with it now. And what's the barriers to dealing with it now? I think that's it. You know, I'll go back to say one of the reasons I love the presentation was because I always talk about appropriate technology, and I always start talking about start with yourselves and then your local community and then make it a regional thing. You know, this is how you grow. And if you're looking as a developing nation, for the model for cooperation and collaboration, you might not want to look to the United States because we're about competition. And competition has its place and it's good in some ways, but it can overlook all the ways that collaboration and cooperation are applicable to today's crisis, because we're all in this together and none of us can do it alone. We must cooperate, we must collaborate. And these are not the United States is not really terribly good at this. So maybe we need to pay attention to developing nations. The other thing I was really impressed with is that, you know, I'm not going to go so far as to say mushrooms are smarter than I am, but, you know, maybe they fit best. And the Darwinian notion of the survival of the fittest are the ones that fit best. And mushrooms are fitting best. And humans are not. Humans are destroying the very planet they live on. And the wildfires in California create toxic air. You don't want to breathe that air. And evolution is not going to save us from that. We cannot evolve in time. So, you know, some of these things, like in Northern California, again, you know, we're really famous for almond growing. Well, it's too much water, too water intensive. We can't grow almonds anymore. And it is a great economic dislocation when you say stop growing almonds, start growing pears. Oh yeah, pears don't need as much water, but they take 10 years before they really bear fruit. So, you know, this is not trivial, the things that we're talking about. And what about red wine? Does anybody out there like to drink red wine? Well, the wildfires, the air poisons the skin of the grapes. So it tastes terrible. And so okay, if you're drinking white wine, they peel the skin off, so you're okay. But, you know, again, an economic dislocation that's amazingly difficult. And we were just talking before we came live about why can't we just transport water from the regions in the country that are, or the world that are getting deluged, rainfalls of unprecedented nature, and just pipe them to areas of drought. You know, what's the barrier? Policy barrier. And we're irrationally organized by municipalities, state, and nations. Nature doesn't have these boundaries. They don't exist in nature. You know, it's man-made. These boundaries are man-made, and they get in the way of using the technology because the technology is there. The presentation made that clear. We can do it. There's no barrier except political will. And because we're irrationally organized, we come up with irrational solutions to these problems. And we need to
Mhm.
be rational about this. So maybe it's a region rather than a state, an individual state making up its own mind. Maybe it's the Northwest. Man, they got this heat wave. We used to call it heat wave, and now they call it heat dome. That wasn't even in my vocabulary. So now, that's a regional response that's necessary. You can't do it by, okay, Portland's going to do this, Seattle's going to do that. That's not how it's going to get done. So we have to collaborate. We have to think outside the boundaries that we have self-imposed upon ourselves. There's so many wonderful things that have come up that I wanted to address. But, these are the things that, you know, we have climate change deniers. Okay, we have fewer of them, but we can't wait until they're all waking up to the fact that climate change is real. We have climate change naturalists. Oh, climate change occurs in nature naturally. Well, that begs the question. The question is, has man had a role in it? And the answer is yes. Since the dawn of the industrial age, man has been influencing not only weather patterns, because as David would say, the climate is a system of weather systems. And so what we have is man influencing the overall system, systems locally and systems globally. That's what makes us all in this together. And that's why we can't do it
Mhm.
ourselves, and that's why we have to cooperate with one another. I could go on, but I think the last thing I'll say is, we have a green party. We have lots of green parties. Maybe we need a blue
Mhm.
party so that we think of the ocean as well, because there's
Mhm.
islands of plastic. They never existed before. They exist now. What about the ocean? So thanks again, Sharif. What a wonderful show.
Thank you, Mr. Adam.
Thank you, Sharif. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Just barely. You're still
Oh,
very quiet.
damn it. I say this every episode. I really do need a new microphone. Sorry. So thank you, Sharif, and everyone. I was having some interesting thoughts earlier. This topic reminded me of astrology. Bear with me. And people invested in astrology talk about the effect that cosmic bodies and movements have on our lives and well-being. Maybe astrology was a bad example. Perhaps astrobiology instead. And for some people, for some reason, people don't really pay as much attention to the effect weather patterns and climates have on health, well-being, life quality, except for the examples Mr. Marshall and nobody else mentioned. So this is a good topic to talk about, and it is really interesting to try and find correlations between climate and weather and culture. For example, as well as health. For example, I can't remember where I heard it or read it. Um, Actually, having said that, I think I do. I think it may have been on Facebook in one of the effective altruism groups or communities about bioethics. It was a post or comment that reported a potential possible link between heat waves and higher homicide rates in Brazil. I think it was urban areas in particular, actually, like Sao Paulo or the capital, Brasilia. And I would dare say that it applies to somewhere like New York City as well, particularly heightened temperatures with heightened homicide rates and rates of violent crime in general. But I do think that the study of connections and correlations between climates, weather patterns with cultures, temperaments, national characteristics, and health is overlooked. But there would be a lot of interesting results, I think, with biometeorology, perhaps. Another good example to illustrate this would be the Mediterranean, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece. A lot of the populations in these kinds of countries have a recognizable idiosyncratic character that distinguishes them. They're very life-loving, vibrant, warm, sensuous people, very beautiful people. And of course, we all know what the climate is like across the Mediterranean. And that contrasts quite sharply with somewhere like the UK, where I'm at, especially modern Britain. And for me, there is a much more dark, foreboding atmosphere here, and unfortunately, we have the weather to match, and I mean the word atmosphere in more ways than one. There certainly is a more depressing heaviness here. Downtrodden would be a good word to describe this, and mental health problems here have skyrocketed. You can see it in people's faces and postures. So the contrast is sharp when compared next to my previous example of the Mediterranean, particularly in what we call the old world or the traditional world, when cultures were more distinct and separated still before this global village, which we recognize now. So I was happy that Professor David mentioned mental health here with regards to today's topic. And please don't get me wrong, there is still an abundance of beauty here in England, but this is still an observation that I've noted. So perhaps we could conclude that, like plants, we need sunlight, obviously. I know there has been a lot of alarmist and conspiratorial murmurings and frantic reportage about sun dimming, so I won't dwell too long on it. But I would still like to say that sun dimming would be deleterious on our mental and physical health. And also, there is an interesting author named Roy Barzilai who wrote a book called the testosterone hypothesis, and one of the ideas it talks about is a possible link between average testosterone levels, and not just men but people in general, a possible link with solar cycles. So increased solar activity helped keep T levels high, thus more tyrants were overthrown, people had a greater lust for life, big families, bountiful lives, and then things started to dip, plunging us into dark ages full of oppression and misery and persecution and so on. So yes, endocrinometeorology or climato-endocrinology. So yeah, thank you, Sharif.
Thank you. This is actually excellent discussions, and especially I think for our audience, this is very valuable content. So I request Professor Rob, because one of the important aspects come to this discussion, especially policy development. And second
Right.
things from our discussion with the developing nations government, as well as the corporation and academia, this is the major challenges for climate change and healthcare solutions. So how we can develop better policy, as well as how largest corporation, because you are working with many big corporations, so how they can contribute in that area. Professor Rob.
Well, with regard to policy, the impact of climate change is different for almost every country, depending on where it is they're located on the planet. And the issue we've got is a lot of decisions are being made without the data to back them up. Our political leaders tend not to use data to make their decisions. They tend to make decisions based on what they think their constituency would approve and what will get them reelected. And the difficulty, of course, is the constituency is no better connected to data than the politicians are. So you get a lot of decisions that are not connected to what's really going on in the world. That's probably the biggest problem. If we can get to a level of data sharing, again, using something like federated data to protect the confidential information that exists in each country, but so the countries collectively can come together with some base understanding of what the problems are, and then a hierarchy of which ones to address first and foremost to have the greatest impact on their population. That would probably be the best path to fixing the underlying problems. If you can shift the political engine from one that is based on poorly founded opinion to one that is solidly based on actual environmental and socioeconomic data, then you can have better decisions. The other issue we've got is that politicians, to a large extent, don't think strategically, they think tactically. So they're concerned about what's happening in the next few months. They're not really concerned about what's happening, 5, 10 years from now. Certainly, when we're talking about the very dire impacts of climate change, you're talking about impacts that are out 30 years or more. They're just not going to be very, very interested in that, because from their standpoint, that's not going to get them reelected. That's not going to get them bang for the buck. That's not going to increase the number of people that are contributing to their campaigns. And so the end result is we've got a disconnect between what the politicians should be doing and what they are doing, and it's largely due to the fact that they're not making decisions on data, and that they're highly tactical and not strategic. And until we can address those two things, we probably can't make great progress in this area. We can certainly talk about it. We can drive our own personal behaviors, but driving a larger, and at this particular point, a global initiative to fix the underlying problems, we're going to be badly hampered by the fact that way too many people are acting against the common good. And the reason for that, once again, is the lack of data and a lack of coordination to actually make solid improvements. So if I were putting this together, if I'm a political entity or if I'm an administrator of some kind, what I want is a hierarchical list of here are the top 30 things I should be focused on to increase the health and happiness of my population. And each one should be addressed in turn. And as they're addressed, then move on to the next one so you make progress. Where right now, what we're often doing is we're spending our efforts trying to do a whole lot of things at once, none of which are done well or done completely. And so the progress is less than what we would otherwise get. We've got point efforts. For instance, we were talking about ocean-borne plastics a little while ago, James. Even about ocean-borne plastics is a huge problem. There are individual companies that have popped up that are trying to pull this stuff out of lakes, rivers, and oceans. But the worldwide effort is, if anything, lacking. It just isn't where it needs to be, given the amount of plastics that are making it into the food chain. And that goes back to health, because you get this plastics into your food, they're carcinogenous. The cancer does drive a lack of health and huge expenses in the medical arena. That pulls money from other things. So the end you get if you don't focus on doing this stuff systematically, you end up with just a ton of secondary problems that consume the money that you would otherwise spend fixing the problem, and you just don't make progress. So I mean, it's little stuff. Beth Love was pointing out that a vegan diet, a vegetable-based diet, something I hadn't heard before, something that should be common knowledge, would improve your defenses against COVID. I mean, it's something we all should know, yet we don't, because that information is not widely shared. Instead, we're chasing around horse pills and whatever drug of the moment is that doesn't have an impact on the disease, based on somebody that is undoubtedly trying to spike the stock of some particular pharma company. So this lack of good information being driven into not only the politicians but the individuals is causing huge problems. We had Facebook go down for a day, and that might have been one of the most beneficial things that happened to us for a long period of time, because one of the greatest sources of false news was off air for a day. And I think I'm suspicious that Facebook did this on purpose, just to remind us about how important Facebook was. But if that was the case, what it reminded me of was how much damage that service does, and how much need we have to regulate it, to make sure that people are properly informed, both in and out of politics, so that decisions are made on verified factual data, not on somebody's whim or short-term financial interests. And so fixing this problem really does require a data-based approach and a mechanism that favors decisions based on that data and considers strategic efforts at least in balance with tactical ones, so we're not constantly bouncing from one initiative to another, and we can make meaningful progress over long periods of time. Because something like climate change, you're only going to make a difference if you work on this and adequately resource it to make a difference. If you don't, you're just hitting your head against the wall, which is kind of pointless for everybody. I think David had a question.
Thank you. Professor David Smith.
Rob, as always, you hit some of the key points that are so important here. And one of the questions we always get around to is, what can people do? Where are the action points and things? And I think many of you know I'm a IC² fellow, but one of the things that happens there is that as you look at what's happening, some of the spin-outs have been things. For example, here in Texas, there's an organization called EarthShare. And what EarthShare has done is very effectively pull together many of the smaller organizations, many of the academic programs, many of the corporate programs, and the public programs, to try to pull them together to achieve a greater good. And that's very important as I think you look at the future. Similar Since several people on here are from Stanford and things, if you go inside Stanford and look at what Media X has done under Martha, and over at Medicine X, which I've been involved with both of them, they are trying to coalesce all the various stakeholders together to impact the changes that they see are necessary on a global basis. So one of the things that from a policy standpoint is to begin to say, where are the places where we can form a consortia of all these different groups that are putting together the individual pieces to solve the problems around healthcare and climate change? How can we bring them to a critical mass? How can we work across geopolitical boundaries to make a difference? And you really have to, in both healthcare and climate change, but even more importantly, when you combine the two, work across geopolitical boundaries. Uh, it's a necessary evil in this space, but it's one that if you look at the data, and as Rob often says, let the data drive it. This is a place where the data really supports the need for a consortia type of approach to be successful in here. Beth has brought out so many of the very interesting points of connecting it to the actualities of what we're doing, to the actualities of the land use or the water use. And Rob, particularly his comments on the plastic input in the waters are really right on. But then you also have to go back to the other elements. I mean, I'm old enough to understand all about the acid rain, and it's kind of left the news realm today. But if you go and look at the oceans and what some of the critical factors are in the oceans, the acid in the oceans are still inhibiting health healthy use of all the water and things. They're going into the fish, they're going into the other wildlife. They're beginning to go into food when we use it for transponics and other things, unless we filter the water to take out the impurities, including that. So there's a whole lot of elements. We're making great progress on some of the science parts of this, but the science parts need to scale to a global impact. Most of the science projects tend to be very focused on that. And, it's kind of very interesting there. And I love the comments that go along with this. Donald, you and I should talk about Media X, because I was actually the keynote speaker on their future work session a couple of years ago. But as you look at how those pieces come together, it takes the coalescing of disparate groups in healthcare, in climate change, in government, in academia, in the corporate world to have a significant impact. And we're at a point where the need for significant impacts are growing all the time. And it's going to take this collective actions. I was an executive at two of the large consortia, the MCC consortia and the Cimatec consortia. And both of those consortia worked and fulfilled their missions of helping recover the computer industry and helping recover the semiconductor industry and putting together in place modern approaches to working in those spaces. I think the same thing is needed, particularly in healthcare as it relates to climate change. And I think that's a recommendation, Sharif, that governments, particularly developing nation governments, should actively consider.
Thank you, Professor David Smith. Professor David Schumacher.
Yes, I hear a few themes that I want to comment about. James and others that are talking about cooperation, collaboration. That's a theme that we need to carry forward. And getting back to public policy, that's my approach as far as that's concerned. Going back to what I talked about earlier about the Colorado River, that runs through 7 states. It runs through 2 countries. That requires a collaborative and a cooperative approach. It requires an emphasis on the common good, but not just appealing to the common good, but showing that the common good really is the common good and that it is the best for you and me as well as it being the best for everybody. Without digressing too much, I think we've seen in COVID that a lot of the appeals to the common good haven't been effective by people that are more interested in how it affects them and how it affects their neighbors, and being able to show that this can improve yourself and your neighbors, as well as then taking the higher value of impacting everybody else in a positive way is a good way forward. So what about those policies? Those policies have to include mitigation and adaptation, not just one or the other. We can't science our way out of this, as much as I'm a science geek, and we also can't restrict our way out of this, I don't believe. I think we need both of those. And I want to comment on, say yes to Beth, talking about opportunity, that this needs to be put into the framework of opportunity. Too much of the news that I hear is doom and gloom, and I think it leads people with the idea of, well, there's nothing I can do about it then, let's move on. Um, so the policy that's science-based, but as an opportunity to, well, for example, it's an opportunity in the public sector, uh, driving public policy, and maybe looking at the real nature of how politics works versus how I would like to see it work. And we can have politicians that benefit from being able to take steps and show people that they are making their particular lives and whatever their particular area is, the people that are going to vote for them, and then from a wider area, people that are going to contribute to their campaigns. In the private sector, innovation and entrepreneurship should drive a lot of this. Looking at innovative ways to solve these problems, not trying to use yesterday's solutions more or better or whatever, but looking at new and open ways to do this. And I think this can benefit things such as seeing a plant-based diet as innovative and moving forward and something that's in everybody's best interest may be the best way to take on the established interests that would want to suppress that. And that's just one example. You can apply it to whatever kind of examples that you want. And then to the theme about data, I really like that. We have the ability to be able to collect data. We have big data being used a lot in business to drive business interests. We're starting to see, or I'm starting to see, that it's being used to drive political interests, of course, as well. But we can use that data to solve a lot of problems that can be beneficial for business, can be beneficial for politics, if we, the people, demand what our definition of beneficial is. Now, one scientific and maybe an innovative area for this, I think was touched on briefly earlier, had to do with using AI and machine learning as a multiplier. That's what's being used in business to be able to drive trends these days, see where markets are going, see where new things are emerging. We need to apply this to climate change and the corresponding health that goes with that. And then, Sharif, I want to say to you that Malaysia and Asia Pacific and all other countries need to be integrated, and they are a valuable part of what's going on. I started by talking about 7 states in the US that share the Colorado River and why that needs to be, we need to have collaboration and cooperation. We can expand that to the worldwide idea that this is not a problem for one country or a few countries. It's a problem for all countries, even though it might be at different levels. Good ideas exist in those countries because people have good ideas, and we need to value the different cultures in the countries because different cultural lenses will see opportunities that other ones will not. And we can share that and move forward. So the
Thank,
themes that we've come out of with this discussion today have been very beneficial. And thank you so much.
thank you, Professor David Schumacher. Madam Betlab.
Thank you. Yeah, so this has been a very rich discussion, and I have so much to agree with what's been said. I'm not going to try to pull together the themes, but thank you, David, for doing so. Let's see. I want to start by tagging on to some of the things that have been said, and I want to start with you, James. James, I love so much. I love you. Period. I've been on this panel many times with you. I love your energy. You're very inspiring. And I love so many things you said today. No barrier except political will, and that we're the only species that's destroying our home. And that we have, that we really need to do something about this. But I do want to kind of gently push back against a couple of things. One is I don't like to hear that idea about almonds being a bad culprit in the water shortage reinforced. Because yes, almonds, it takes a whole gallon of water to grow one almond. And so in the plant kingdom, there's many, many more choices that you could make that are less water hungry than that. But when you consider how almonds are used compared to how the real water guzzlers are used, you can see that it's really a drop in the bucket. And it's a smokescreen. When all that news came out about the almonds, it was really a smokescreen. Because really in the state of California, what's draining our aquifers, what's draining our wells, and what's draining our surface waters, just like in those 7 states you mentioned, David, along the Colorado River, is animal agriculture, not growing almonds. If you take the amount of water that it takes to grow 1/4 pound burger, and you instead grow almonds with it, you get 4.5 cups of almonds. Nobody sits down and eats 4.5 cups of almonds, and there's tons more nutrition in that 4.5 cups of almonds than there is in that 1/4 pound burger. How many people do you know that'll slam down 2 or more 1/4 pound burgers? So it's a scale situation, and so I just want to encourage you not to repeat that anymore. Speaking of which, going to David, your comment about the Colorado River and what's happening in your state. And my heart just goes out to you. I mean, we're having drought in California too, which is having a huge impact. We're having water shortages in our town and water rationing. And the worst impact, of course, is the way the soil is so dry from years and years of drought. And we're having these wildfires. I just recently went on another train trip. I've gone on 2 train trips across the country this year. And I went through many of those states along the Colorado River. And even though I knew the statistics, I knew that we're using the vast majority of our land to grow a small percentage of our food, and that we're wasting so much in that way, and that percentage of our food, the animal products we're eating, is a primary culprit in destroying human health, destroying the environment, destroying human integrity. Even though I knew the facts, to go in a train across the country and to see mile after mile after mile after mile of these huge fields that were growing crops to feed to animals, knowing the tremendous amount of waste. You can take 1 pound, this is according to the National Beef Cattlemen's Association or something, 1 pound of grain will raise 10.8 pounds of grain will raise 1 pound of meat. Everybody else's figures are much higher, but let's use that conservative figure, that 10.8 pounds of grain for 1 pound of beef. You can get 700 and some tortillas for that same 10.5 pounds of beef. I mean, it's like so wasteful. So here I know all this stuff, and I'm going across the country and I'm seeing it. And then the other thing I'm seeing is mile after mile after mile of dead land, no longer growing anything, cracked soil. And guess why that is? That's because we came in and we cleared the natural vegetation and we put our animals on it or raised feed for our animals. And this is happening worldwide. So let's restore the aquifers. Let's restore the water in the wells. The Ogallala aquifer that's under many of those states, it's in danger. Like, this is the water that we rely on for our life and that all life relies on. Let's restore it by shifting toward plant strong diets. I had a couple other things I want to mention. The oceans were brought up, such an important topic. Acid rain, yeah, it's primarily from carbon dioxide falling on the ocean, right? And it's destroying the skeletons of these little creatures that are an important part of the food chain. So that's an important issue. And the plastics are also really critical. But let's also talk about what's causing the ocean dead zones, these vast swaths of ocean where nothing will grow. Well, what's causing that is nitrogen and phosphorus, excess nitrogen and phosphorus, which are flowing in the rivers and the creeks down to the ocean. And they're feeding these vast blooms of algae that are choking out all other life and eventually themselves as well. And where is that coming from? That is coming from our human, talk about the only species that destroys our earth, our human application of fertilizers, nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, the primary use of which is for these huge tracts of feed, again, 10.8 at minimum, probably much more, pounds that are required for a pound of meat. So we're growing these huge fields to feed the animals, to feed the people. And that fertilizer, most of it's not taken up by the plants. Most of it goes in the soil and goes downstream. Another huge source of the nitrogen fertilizer is the off-gassing. The nitrogen flowing into the ocean is the off-gassing from the manure. And that's a source of methane as well. So we again, that same industry. I think I just have one or two more things. Let's see. Yeah, okay, one more that I want to address, and then two more things I want to address. One is that this, somebody, I can't remember who, I wrote it down. Donald, organic agriculture takes up more room. So one of the things that people often talk about is organics. It's easier for us that are environmentalists to talk about organics and how it's going to make things better, or local and how that's going to make things better. And, there's a number of studies that have come out that have shown that what you eat is much more important than how it was grown or where it was grown. And that what we really need to look at is whether it's animal or plant products that we're raising. And there's quite a bit of scholarship out about this, that it's really more about what you're eating than about where it's grown or how it's grown. Those things are not as important in terms of emissions. And finally, I just want to say, because we're on the topic of health and climate change, that health is a birthright. We deserve to have health, and as we already revealed in this session, there's information that was found in the world by scientists through good scholarship that found that people who are eating mostly plants have a 73% reduced risk of having a bad case of COVID than those who are not eating mostly plants. But nobody in this room knew that except for me. And that is criminal. And what I want to say is, it's not just COVID. There has been studies for decades, starting back in the 50s, but certainly in the 70s with the McGovern Commission, that made it really clear that the cause of our killer diseases, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, many cancers, et cetera, that the cause of it is our diets, and that there's one aspect of our diet that is contributing the most to this epidemic of worldwide chronic diseases, especially in the developing world where we eat so much meat, and that is our animal product consumption. And that if we can reduce our animal product consumption, it's going to save so many lives. It's so hard for me to hear and see about people having a heart attack and not knowing that there was a way to prevent it, and not knowing that in many cases it can be reversed through diet. And that is criminal. And that we have allowed these corporations to colonize our minds and colonize our advertising and colonize our communities with this idea that we need animal protein and that we need a lot of it, and that's a status symbol, and all the rest, that you need it to build muscles, all the rest that's been disproved over and over. That is criminal, and I'm frankly angry about it. So I just want to invite everybody here, please join me in integrating the issue of diet. And many of you are, and many of you have. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I appreciate your allyship. We must integrate this issue into the climate crisis conversation and activism and policy, or we're not going to make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Betlav. Mr. Marshall.
Yeah, that was a good discussion right there about health and the connection of diet to health. I'm going to bring some other issues to the table real quick that I haven't heard mentioned in this conversation. One is an historical fact. Back in the 90s and the early 2000s, in the city of Chicago, there was an effort by the city of Chicago to grow plant-based crops on rooftops. I don't know how many people know that. And also in high rises. It was a big fanfare for about 6 months, and then it disappeared. It's interesting. The city hall and the state hall, that's the same building. They're two. It's one large building, but it's split into two: one for the state and one for the for the city. Still has crops being grown on the top of it. I don't know if you know that, but it hasn't taken off, and I think there's a lot of reasons why it hasn't. And I think some of the conversation here, the policy issues, tend towards that. One of the things, if somebody, I'm more than happy to work with the folks on this. One of the tools in order to get policies in place, but also actions to take place, is a form of. It comes from marketing. It's a tool called adoption of innovation, and it not only applies to innovations and technology, but it also applies to policymaking as well. And so, and you can actually quantitatively measure it. It looks like a normal distribution curve when it's has a typical adoption curve, but there is a form of a shift called kurtosis mathematically to the right or to the left, depending on what's going on. Right now, what we're seeing is kurtosis, or a shift to the right. So it makes it much more conservative and much more difficult to create adoption of any policy or any innovation that you bring to the table. So there's methods and practical tools that can be used. And I know that people at Stanford University, you can go to them in the marketing department, or you can come to me and I can help you create the tools that allow adoption and create adoption in a more concentrated and a more aggressive manner. The other element that I want to bring to the table is the conversation about zoonotic diseases and how they impact climate and health. Prior to the pandemic occurring, prior to COVID-19, our team had already been working with 2 virologists and 2 immunologists on the fact that there's a correlation between certain types of chars that we can develop, which is done through pyrolytic carbon capture and storage technology, to take wastes and convert them into chars that can actually improve the soil health, but also livestock as well. But I so wholeheartedly support that our livestock is gotten out of control the way it's being industrialized. All you have to do is drive down Interstate I-5 in California. On the right, you've got the almonds, and on the left, you've got all the factories of beef that are creating methane emissions and all sorts of problems. But if you do regenerative approach to farming, because I do believe that there is a role for livestock, but not the way it is today, you can reduce. We know through the cost action and biochar in Europe, paid for by the European Parliament, that we can reduce the health or the death rates of livestock of all kinds by a minimum of 50%, and improve the health and quality of the livestock. And that's important because, like it's been admitted, humans do consume livestock, and that affects us. But I think it also affects the environment. And the other element that I want to address, because we're addressing it, is which was brought up about the NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from fertilizers that's going into water bodies, bioswales, and eventually into the ocean. I mean, all you have to do is look at Lake Superior in the Great Lakes, and 3/4 of it is covered through harmful algal blooms. And harmful algal blooms create toxins, neurotoxins in people's bodies, also pets, children, adults. So we need to take that into consideration. We're addressing that. we are addressing it through this combination of technologies, but also I think policy will also help change that around. And we have to create an adoption of the policies that have been mentioned here. And we need to do that aggressively, and we need to do it from a quantitative approach, in my opinion. And at that, I'll leave it.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Donald.
It's interesting that he just mentioned diffusion of innovations, because I'm working right now on a paper quite long about the issue of diffusion of innovation when it comes to vaccine hesitancy. And I'm working with a group in Finland called the OASIS Group, Persuasive Technology. And one of the people that I'm in touch with doing this is a guy named Tom Valente, who was Everett Rogers' protege. And Everett Rogers wrote the Bible, the Diffusion of Innovation, which I've read 4 times. Actually, there's later and later editions of it, so I keep reading it. But I agree that those are valuable things. But like everything else, there's intuitive guesses about what will work, and then there's how we measure whether our guesses actually worked or not. And it's very, very expensive and time consuming to measure whether the guesses actually worked or not. So a lot of times we fly by our the seat of our pants saying, well, this must have worked because we believe it'll work. And I think that when we're looking at a situation like this, the developing worlds has completely different problems. And so when we look at something like climate change, right now, the developing world, I forget how many hundreds of millions of people every year get malaria, and a huge percentage and a large percentage of them die, or a significant percentage, I should say. And that is exacerbated by heat, and the kinds of mosquitoes can spread and go to larger areas. And since we've done successful mosquito abatement in the United States and the developed world in general, we don't even see that problem. So it's invisible to us. And so the Gates Foundation is putting in money for research about it and things like that. But in general, it's not something that's salient. And so if we talk about political will to do things, the research funding is a lot more difficult to get for something like that in the United States as something that's sexier. And so I think that what's going to be interesting is in the project here, the World Talent Economic Forum project, of a combination of research and education. I think that as you pointed out, some of the developing countries do have money for some degree of research. And I think that it would be really important for them to turn their fire hose to start looking at problems that are more specific to their areas. So and I think that just taking inventories of the flora and fauna, understanding what is happening with flora and fauna, and being able to understand where it can be grown and where it can't be grown, and where people can live and where people can't live, and where projections of floods and rising sea levels and all those kinds of things. Everyone here has mentioned data, and that data needs to be gathered before we can really start being able to make intelligent decisions about anything. And the last thing I want to mention is that something I often say is that we live in an interconnected web of relationships. So when we do something, we're not doing it completely ourselves. We're thinking about what the people we know are going to think of us when we do it. What are our parents going to think of us? What are our friends going to think of us? And so what winds up happening is that in groups in connected networks, people wind up taking some sort of a view like the vaccines are toxic, or global warming doesn't really exist, and any money that we spend researching it is a waste of money. And how do you change a person? Because it isn't that individual that you're trying to change. It's the whole network that they're in who share these common beliefs. And I think this is it's something that we talk about using marketing and diffusion of innovation, and those are some areas where we've actually got some sort of purchase in the ability to be able to start measuring things. I'm a big proponent of social network analysis, which is core to Roger's stuff, and I think that one of our first steps is to really start asking questions and answering them, because we really don't know very much at all right now, sadly.
Thank you, Mr. Adam.
I wanted to say how much I love Mr. James Eads' idea for a blue party concerning our seas and oceans, just like how the Green Party does for on land nature. Maybe we could have a dark blue party for the seas and oceans, and a light blue party for the sky, the air, and the atmosphere. Although, having said that, I suppose the atmosphere comes under the green umbrella. It just made me think about the oceans, how much left there is to explore and discover down there in the deepest trenches. We know alien life exists when we see some of these bioluminescent wonders. I know it's now become something of a cliche that we know more of space than we do about what's down there in the deepest levels of our oceans, but we must take this into consideration. I feel that not only must we avoid destroying what we know of our ecosystem, we need to remember that there's plenty left yet to discover, and we do not want that to go either, of course. What a shame it would be on an explorational level to destroy parts of our world before even having a chance to find them, discover them, and learn about them. And there is still plenty left yet to discover about knowledge that is already catalogued, of course. And like I mentioned earlier, movements like effective altruism, bioethics, and the abolition of suffering, etc., are gaining some traction. More people are going vegan, and ideas like speciesism are being supported by growing numbers of adherents, or anti-speciesism rather. So hopefully it won't be too long before we can establish some kind of rapport with other intelligent species like cetaceans, and use interspecies relationships and friendships would feed back to us. Our innovations will help establish links with them, and these links will continue to influence us in positive ways, hopefully. I know that idea in particular sounds like science fiction, but I think we already have the technical feasibility to achieve something like that alongside other seemingly outlandish sounding ideas you see circulating around futurism and transhumanism. The Star Trek movie, Star Trek 4 The Voyage Home from 1986, I believe, is a good movie that uses this as a theme for the storyline. And I wanted to second what Mr. David Schumacher said about the effect of the news, mainstream media reports, newspapers, social media, all of that on our mental health, since we are discussing health, both mental and physical. So we need to do something about that. What exactly, I'm not quite sure. People have been espousing and doing and writing about the benefits of practices like digital detoxes and social media detoxes, which are very noble and effective practices, but would someone doing that still just be an internet addict who's taken a break for a week or two? And for many people, it just isn't feasible. And when we had that blackout the other night, when Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram went down, I was a bit heartbroken because I had lots of original content I was wanting to back up. So I was relieved it finally all came back eventually. And I saw some bravado from some of my online friends about how disappointed they were that it came back, but I wasn't convinced. So yes, mental health again. Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you, Mr. James Eid.
Thank you, Sharif. I started this program with a blank page, and I don't know if you can see this, but it's now filled with notes. This always happens to me on your shows. You collect great panelists, and we have wonderful discussions. I'm not being defensive here, but I want to talk to what Reverend Beth said about the almonds. You know, I wasn't blaming the almonds, and I wasn't blaming the red wine, the red grapes. You know, I was just trying to point out that the climate effect has caused things. The climate change has caused these effects that are creating tremendous economic dislocation, and that was my main point. And there's going to be more economic dislocation to come. You know, we have to buckle up because it's not going to be a bump-free ride. And if we do what we need to do, I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, we think about the political will, and that's part of it. And I love the idea that the politicians think tactically rather than strategically because they have to worry about being primaried first, and then, you know, getting their enough money to be able to fund their campaign because, you know, money is the driving force about success in politics. And you know, I also pointed out that the majority of CEOs are forced to think tactically and not strategically as well. So this is a business question because they have a quarterly number that they have to hit, and if they miss it, they're under fire. So this is you know, not long-term thinking. Now there are long-term thinkers out there, but they don't seem to be rewarded politically, and they don't seem to be rewarded so often in our business communities either. So this tactical thinking is reinforced, and strategic thinking is not so much valued. This is one of the difficulties that we're facing and must overcome. And the other is the, you know, the data collection and the reliance on data and the data sharing. You know, that's great. And all the panelists here, I know, love data, love thinking about it, love the analysis. And but we're talking about rational thinking. And we have to get over the fact that people are rational. Political systems are rational, economic systems are rational, you know, because we're not dealing with logic here. So data is only going to get us so far because we have been taught to pursue our own selfish interests, you know, and like there's some invisible hand that's going to make it all better. You know, I think that's nonsense. And what we really want to be pursuing is our enlightened self-interest. And our enlightened self-interest includes others, includes the effects that our behavior has on others. And so if we pursued our enlightened self-interest, we would be much further along. But that again assumes something that I don't observe in human beings around the world as much as I see this narrow pursuit of self-interest. So what are we going to do? You know, and you know, the talk about the vegan and the food issues, so important because right now in the United States, there are food deserts. They're in urban environments, in our cities, food deserts where the only calories are cheap calories, which are meat, burgers, things like that, fast food kinds of things. So this can't be ignored either. The food deserts that are in our urban environments separate the rich from the poor. The rich can afford to get any food they want. The poor are deprived of that opportunity. They would love to eat organic vegetables, but they can't find them. They can't afford them. So let's not forget them as well. And you know, we've had this mindset of inexhaustible resources. We thought the rivers were inexhaustible until they caught fire. We thought the ocean is inexhaustible. We thought the air is inexhaustible. Well, guess what, people? They're not inexhaustible. They can be used up, and we can poison them, and we are. So we have to think about this in new and novel ways that our grandparents didn't have to think about. So now, since we're forced with novel problems, we need novel solutions. And what is this? How are we going to take all this data, even if we could share all this data and convince everybody rationally? We won't convince a large portion, no matter how much data we give them. A large portion of our communities just won't buy it. But you know, the solution I see is leadership. You know, we have seen social change across the country, across time, based on leadership. Whether it's Mahatma Gandhi, whether it's Nelson Mandela, wherever real change has been effected, it has been based on a leadership and people following that leader's mode. Now, and the other thing is which our human tendency, our natural human tendency, is to respond to fear and anger. And so we had a leader in this country raising our fears and raising our level of anger, and it's still affecting our country so that we can't collaborate, we can't work, we're full of distrust. And all of our trust in our social institutions have been broken. So now we must rebuild them. And how do we do that? We need great leaders. We need great leaders saying the right things, inspiring people rather than making them afraid. Because I never made good decisions when it came from fear, anger, or shame. And I don't think most people do. So we must be able to hold our heads high, look people in the eye, and agree to disagree at times, and still respect one another. So this is the thing that I would most like to end, because we don't need to build any more walls between us. There's plenty of walls already. If someone's telling you to build another one, don't go for it. Tear down the walls and build bridges instead. And if you want to just sit on the sidelines and say it's too big a problem for me, well, you're just another brick in the wall. So everybody's got to do their part. Start with yourself. Influence those around you. Let them influence those in their social spheres. Who knows where it'll end? But we're irrationally organized now as a society. We don't pretend that we're going to become rational tomorrow. So what we need is inspiration and leadership, because that will transcend our irrational fears, our irrational anger, and all of these things that we need to have the social and political will to make the changes that are necessary for us to get out of this terrible crisis that we are in. Thanks again, Sharif, for a wonderful show.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, all of our speakers for contributing World Talent Economy Forum. Open dialogue is an art, but definitely we need to know that how we can utilize our open dialogue in the real world. So World Talent Economy Forum is the place where you can utilize your knowledge, your solutions, your expertise for these developing nations. And I can ensure that not only Malaysia, many important countries, as well as the millions of people, they believe that we can do that. And we need action. Most important thing is that we need action. Beside these discussions, beside this open dialogue, we need to take actions how we can solve these climate change issues, how we can solve these healthcare issues, how we can solve this affordable housing issue, how we can solve these unemployment issues. So that is the key. So we are working on these things, and I believe there are many good people in politics, there are many good people in corporate, there are many good people in academia. All of the good peoples, I believe 90% people actually good, all of the good people actually collaborate, and they can contribute and they can take actions. The social problem will be solved. That is the things, and that is our motto. So that's why we are moving forward. And I believe Malaysian prime ministers and the many countries prime minister, they already start to believe that we can do that. We are actually providing different kind of solutions with our open dialogues. I believe the next 1 year will be a lot more interesting dialogue, a lot of good opportunities, and lot of I said that a good initiative World Talent Economy Forum will take, but we need support. We need scientists. We need academician. We need solutions. We need government body. That is the way we will move forward. Thank you, Professor David Schumacher, Mr. James Eid, Madam Beth Love, Mr. Adam, Professor David Smith, and Professor Rob for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Let's prepare for a lot of action and lot of initiative, and let's change this world. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.
Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.